If Matthew was a 10-hour trip, a 10-hour journey, we are an hour and 24 minutes into the journey. We have been walking so slow through Matthew. And it hit me this week that it has been 7 weeks since we started Matthew 4. We were in Matthew 4 for 7 weeks. But we're trying our best to push against this kind of hurried posture that we tend to have moving through this book. So we're going very, very slow. You will get through it eventually. But I hope that you're holding on. Is everyone holding on so far as we've been journeying through Matthew? Wonderful. At least we changed the sermon graphic for you today, just to kind of change it up a bit. Because in some ways, we take a major turn today by stepping into the Sermon on the Mount, which covers Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. 3 chapters here in Matthew are what constitute the classic Sermon on the Mount. Now, in the opening teaching on Matthew, I mentioned to you that Matthew is thematically focused on the teachings of Jesus uniquely. And he structures his entire gospel account around 5 blocks of Jesus' teaching. The Sermon on the Mount is the first and most significant of the 5. So that's the turning point that we're making today, stepping into this first block of the 5 teachings, that being the Sermon on the Mount. Also, remember that Matthew is very Jewish and is presenting Jesus to the people of Israel as the long-awaited Davidic-like Messiah. One who would usher in the promised rule, reign, and kingdom of Yahweh. Well, that kingdom project and kingdom vision and mission was announced and launched in Matthew chapter 4. But there is one other character that Matthew wants to draw the audience to as a parallel in the story of Israel. And he has been doing this subtly, but the Sermon on the Mount makes it much more explicit. Matthew 5:1 says, "Now when Jesus saw the crowds," keep in mind, Jesus has begun his ministry, preaching, teaching, healing. And at the end of Matthew 4, it basically says that there are crowds of people beginning to follow Jesus. So he saw the crowds, and as he sees the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Keep in mind, sitting was the posture of a teacher in the first century, not standing. A teacher would sit in the first century. But it specifically says he went up on a mountainside. Now, this is the first of 5 blocks of teachings, which is unique, and we'll connect it here in just a second to the story of Israel. But it says here that he goes up on a mountain to deliver the most significant of the 5 blocks of teaching. So who might Matthew be drawing our attention to in the story of Israel as an allusion or a parallel? Matthew is drawing our attention to Moses. To Moses. Jesus, in some ways, is a new Moses. Not as one who is replacing Moses, but as one who is fulfilling Moses. One who also went up on a mountain numerous times and serves as the central figure of the Torah, which happened to be the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, or our Old Testament. The word Torah actually means, in the Hebrew, teaching. It means teaching or doctrine. The Torah is the teaching of the Hebrew people. And Moses is the central figure. So we're beginning to see a parallel here. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus just spent 40 days in the wilderness. Moses rescued the people out of Egyptian bondage, and Jesus is rescuing people out of the dominion of darkness. Do we see the parallel to Moses? Moses gives the law of God, and now the lawgiver is going to give his manifesto for living the life of the kingdom of God. Now, what's interesting is the Sermon on the Mount only takes 15 to 20 minutes to read through. It's quite short, much shorter than my sermons, right? I was tempted, honestly, this morning to just read the entire Sermon on the Mount and then sit down and see how you all responded. Half of you would be like, what just happened? The other half are like, man, that was awesome. It was really fast. Let's get out of here. But it's very short. It only takes about 15 or 20 minutes to get through. Yet, some have said the Sermon on the Mount is the greatest moral document of all human history, of all time. Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, committed to meditating on the Sermon on the Mount daily for 40 years and equated it with the same power as the Bhagavad Gita, a powerful text in the Hindu tradition. Gandhi himself said of the Sermon on the Mount, he said, I saw that the Sermon on the Mount was the whole of Christianity for those who wanted to live a Christian life. It is that sermon which has endeared Jesus to me. In it, Jesus will expound on his ethic or his moral vision for how his kingdom people are to live and to conduct themselves. The New Testament scholar Scott McKnight calls it the moral portrait of Jesus' own people. I really love that word picture. The North African theologian St. Augustine called it the perfect standard of the Christian life. That being the Sermon on the Mount. Unfortunately, though, many people in the church and outside of the church have attempted to water down, allegorize, or even disregard what Jesus is actually calling people to live out in this teaching. Because it is shocking, it is rather demanding, it is non-compromising, and it's quite uncomfortable. So we attempt to reinterpret it or allegorize it. Whatever we can do to get out of its requirements of us. But from the mountain, just as Moses did, what Jesus is doing is he is uttering forth God's will for kingdom people, for you and I, for followers of the way. And if Jesus is who we choose to follow, then this is the manifesto. These are the instructions. This is the blueprint for our ethic, for our way. It is the way we follow in the kingdom of heaven. Augustine goes on to call it the precepts by which the Christian life is molded. The rule or the standard, the guiding vision by which we are molded by. But you might be wondering this morning why Shay read the last 6 verses of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7. That is because those last few verses provide for us the baseline for how and why we should engage this world-changing moral vision. To start at the end helps us as we navigate these next 3 chapters. And as slow as we've been going, it's going to take a while. But these last few verses help us understand the how and the why of this moral vision. They show us what to do with these 3 chapters as we walk through them slowly. So that's why we are starting with the end this morning. Verse 24 says, "Therefore," of Matthew chapter 7, "everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice," someone say practice, practice, "is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." Last week, for us, we defined discipleship here at Emmaus. Practicing the way of Jesus together for the renewal of all things. That's what it means to be in discipleship for us at Emmaus. And if you are curious where that came from, ultimately, it came from this passage, this text in Matthew chapter 7. It's actually in the hallway if you go out there and look on the wall. And it really is the call of the entire Sermon on the Mount. It's a consistent theme throughout, as we will see, which is not surprising that it comes right after the first disciples are called to come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. We have to connect the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount with the call of the disciples, with the mission of God. Are you tracking with me? We got the mission, we've got the strategy, we've got the blueprint, the ethic, the vision. So we enter into this sermon with this invitation. Some of us, it's for the first time. And some of us, we're just kind of getting reoriented around what it means to actually follow Jesus. But we see, even in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, this from Jesus. "Whoever practices," there's that word, "and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Notice those 2 words, practices and teaches. Come follow me, I will make you fishers of men. We aren't just becoming disciples, as I have said. We are also becoming rabbis. We're becoming teachers of the way as well. We practice and we teach these commands. So in essence, the entire Sermon on the Mount is bookended by the word practice. Practice at the beginning, as we enter in, and then we exit out, embodying a sort of practice. The Greek word for practice I shared with you all last week because it's actually the same Greek word used to translate make in Matthew chapter 4. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. It's the word poieo. That's the word in Greek. And this Greek word poieo appears in the Sermon on the Mount 16 times. So over the course of the next 3 chapters, this Greek word will appear 16 times throughout. And it's actually a more general word, a more ordinary word for a more specific word, and that word is righteousness. Righteousness, which will appear 5 times in the Sermon on the Mount. Righteousness means rightness. But poieo, to remind you, means to make, to do, to act on, to fashion, to create, to form, or to put into practice. So the text could read Matthew chapter 7. Anyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, or does them, or builds with them, is like a wise man. Now, here's how the Lord works. This is beautiful. I had no role in selecting our songs for our worship set and singing this morning. And we were singing Build My Life. And I was like, this is wild. This was not some sort of cheesy attempt to connect the sermon with the worship set. I promise. I had no clue what the songs were. But I was like, Lord, won't you do it? Like, that is remarkable. So we will see how the two connect, obviously, throughout this entire teaching. There is this sense that Jesus is saying, anyone who hears these words of mine and builds with them is like a wise or thoughtful man or woman. Clearly, Jesus' end goal for the greatest sermon of all time isn't just an applause or even the amazement it produced in the crowd. And it does produce amazement and astonishment. But rather, the end goal is that those who are hearing would put the teachings into practice. That is the end goal. That they adopt it as a way of life, a sort of kingdom moral compass, a kingdom ethic. And there have been all types of approaches to how we derive our ethics throughout time, specifically in moral philosophy. Virtue ethics, you have the Kantian view of ethics and the moral imperative. You have utilitarian ethics. There are all types of ethical visions. But this, I believe, is the greatest ethical vision for the human person, to unleash what it truly means to be an alive person and human being. So it provides this sort of moral compass. It's not just new information, but a new embodied approach to life itself. That is the aim of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The sociologist Jacques Ellul says this. He says, when we become concerned for the effectiveness of the gospel's action and its need to intervene in the world, which we need it to, do we not? It seems that the first objective should be the creation of a way of living. We don't need more theories. We don't necessarily need more ideas. We need a new ethic, a new way of living under the rule and reign of Jesus, who empowers us by his Spirit to live out this way of life in the world as agents of healing, renewal, grace, mercy, justice, and righteousness. Now, every city has a vibe or a culture. How many of you have been to Asheville before? It's got a vibe, does it not? Some of us have been told, hey, you kind of get off Asheville vibes. There's a reason. Why? Good chance you drive a Subaru. Maybe you wear Chacos. Maybe you're vegan. I don't know. Maybe you like folk alternative music, like Fleet Foxes or something. I don't know. But like, there's a certain kind of vibe, right? I remember talking to someone who had met a person, kind of stranger, in Portland, Oregon. And as they talked to the person in Portland, Oregon, they ended up striking up a conversation. And my friend said, yeah, we're from North Carolina. The person's like, oh, well, cool. I'm actually moving to North Carolina. And my friend's like, where are you moving? And the person said, Asheville. Like, that makes a lot of sense. You know? It's like Portland of the South, man. Right? I grew up in Wilmington on the coast. Wilmington's got a vibe. Wilmington's got a culture. I'm a bit of an oxymoron, to be honest with you. I can kind of step into that kind of role, and I could step out very quickly. But Wilmington has a vibe, right? Large surf culture there. A lot of transplants from the West Coast, right? Everyone wears Sanooks, you know, rainbows everywhere, okay? Not in the sky necessarily, but on your feet, right? It's water culture, boat culture, hey dudes everywhere, you know, like that's kind of the vibe, you know. Lot of blonde at the coast, okay? Some natural, some not, hello. Various vibes, you know. New York has a vibe. Different boroughs have different vibes, you know. LA has a certain vibe, you know. Reidsville has a certain vibe. And my wife embodies Reidsville in so many ways. I say all that to say, the city of God, the kingdom of God, has citizens. And therefore has a way of living, has an approach to life, has a culture, has a vibe. So the aim of this sermon is to help us step into this way of life, this kingdom culture. It is a call to action. Apprenticing under Jesus as a Talmid doesn't just take time, but it takes work, effort, and practice. Dallas Willard's famous for saying, grace isn't opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. Following the way of Jesus takes work. It takes effort. It takes practice. If you disagree with that theology, you're going to have a hard time with Jesus because it's everywhere in the Sermon on the Mount, let alone the gospel account. We begin to learn to live as citizens of another world, another kingdom. We become holy people, sacred people, devoted people, a priesthood who has dual citizenship in heaven and earth at the same time. So we begin to embody this way of life. So I would ask you, do you feel as though your way of life embodies the city of God? Are you a product of the culture, quote unquote? That's an important question for us to ask. Now, one of the greatest post-game interviews of all time happened on May 7th, 2002, 22 years ago. Allen Iverson, who, Hall of Fame basketball player, Philadelphia 76ers, right? I actually had a pair of Iversons as a kid, multiple pair of shoes, Iversons. Some of you don't know who Allen Iverson is. That's okay. But in this press conference, Iverson was confronted regarding his practice habits or lack thereof. And in 90 seconds, you can go watch it on YouTube, 90 seconds, Allen Iverson uses the word practice over 20 times. 20 times. We're talking about practice? We're not talking about a game. I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and y'all want to talk about practice? It's fast. 90 seconds, 20 times. Just go look it up. But part of being an athlete is to practice. Practice comes with the territory. Now, we all know that Allen Iverson didn't become who he became without practice. We acknowledge that. But there was the assumption in this press conference that players go to practice. That's what basketball players do. Part of being an athlete is to practice. When your identity is as a basketball player, it is shaped and formed through practice. Now, other side note, I've come to realize that there is a cult brewing in this community. That is the cult of pickleball. You want to talk about discipleship? Hang out with the pickleball players in this community, specifically Grace Heath. She will dominate you and laugh at you while she's dominating you. She takes it so serious. I just played my first little round of pickleball this past week, and one of the things we're going to try to do as an incarnational presence in the neighborhood is to take this kind of abandoned tennis court and do a mobile pickleball court and immerse ourselves in it. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there are some people in this community who have been practicing pickleball and doing it over and over and over again to where they have become pickleball players. You know what I'm saying? Grace Heath. Like, dominant. So it's fascinating. So you need to get around the pickleball crew. Sunday afternoons, they want to talk to you, okay? But I want to say all that to say, there is a difference between a person who plays basketball, let's say, and a basketball player. There is a difference between a person who plays golf and a golfer. If you just go out and play, par 3 somewhere, you're not Scotty Scheffler yet, man. You're not a golfer. You're playing golf. And there's a difference. There's a difference between a person who paints and a painter. My daughter paints at daycare. She's not a painter. You know? They want to call it artwork. I'm like, it's not artwork. It's an activity. Okay? It's to buy the time. You know? I'm trying to figure out what to do with all of it. But I think it's important for us to clarify this morning that the way of Jesus, in all honesty, is more like a sport or an art than a set of ideas. It's much more like a sport or an art than a set of ideas. You take on the identity of a Talmud, you become a Talmud. You live like a Talmud, or a student, or an apprentice. Once you take on that kingdom identity, you begin to live in that kingdom identity. Once the jersey is on, you begin to live as a player, so to speak, in the sport with the jersey on. It's a key distinction I think we need in our Western discipleship crises. Followers of the way of Jesus, hear me, don't just dabble with his ideas. They actually follow them. The difference, honestly, is desire and devotion. The difference between dabbling and being committed has to do with desire and devotion. And when your identity is as a follower or apprentice of Jesus, it is confirmed over time through practice, doing what he says. You cannot separate the two. We as Emmaus, we as the people of God, must practice not what we preach, but what he preaches. When someone says practice what you preach, it's a little off. No. I'm to practice what he preaches. If that's off, let me know. Because if we are just focused on practicing what we preach, we can lower our preaching standards real quick. But when we follow Jesus, that standard never goes away. The Sermon on the Mount is there and has been for 2 millennia. So we have to practice what he preaches. Notice, though, that Jesus is doing something quite interesting in this passage. He is using contrasting images for us. And he will do this often throughout the whole sermon. Here, he contrasts a house built on a rock with a house built on sand. But what's most interesting is that there actually isn't a single command in the parable. Nowhere is there a command in the parable. Instead, he just differentiates the wise one from the foolish one based on whether they practice what he says or not. No command. No imperative. He just differentiates between those who do what he says and those who do not. This is just a claim that Jesus is making about reality. That which is true, which Jesus does a lot. He doesn't say, follow my teaching. He just says, if you do, you're wise. If you don't, you're foolish. This is Jesus becoming a philosopher. He's engaging the conversation of wisdom. You are wise if you follow my teaching, and you are foolish if you do not. If you do follow my teaching, you're like a wise person who builds their house on a rock. If you don't follow my teaching, you're like a foolish person who builds their house on sand. And he makes this claim about everyone. Because he says, everyone who hears these words of mine, or anyone who hears these words of mine. Notice the invitation, how open it is. He's not just talking to his disciples. He's not just talking to religious leaders or to religious people. He says, if any of you hear these words of mine and do them, then you're wise. If you don't, you're foolish. Meaning, if anyone doesn't do his teachings, that person's actually foolish. So he makes this claim about reality. Now, wisdom, quickly, is knowing the right way to act at the right time. That's what wisdom is. Right thinking, right time. knowing what to do, when to do it. And wisdom, if we're honest, has been lost in the information age. We have swapped out information for wisdom. We have exchanged the two. We have information coming at us from all angles, all the time, in quick little snippets, producing, honestly, a lack of depth and a lack of wisdom. But wisdom is knowing the right way to act at the right time. And timing is an interesting element in this parable because Jesus says, at some point, your house, which is a metaphor for your entire life, your relationships, your work, your behavior, your habits, all of it will be tested. A storm will come. And if you don't, not just Christians or followers of the way, any person, if you don't follow my teaching, your home, your life will be destroyed. Do you know what a destroyed home is called? Condemned. Condemned. A destroyed home is called condemned. Now, is that something God does, or is that something that we do? John chapter 3, Jesus says in his conversation with Nicodemus, whoever does not believe stands condemned already. Light came into the world, but people loved darkness instead. We've seen it enough, friends. Friends, family members, people around us, celebrities, leaders, whose lives are destroyed in the matter of a moment because lacking wisdom. It doesn't take long, guys, for any of us to be in prison for the rest of our life. We're one decision away from being locked up forever. That is wild, right? That's fascinating. But even for some of us, little small habits, deformative habits, over time can erode our home if we're not careful. And he says, if you don't follow my teaching, when the storm comes, when the pressure is on, the house will be destroyed. And a destroyed house is a condemned house. But he didn't come to bring condemnation. He came to bring life, eternal life. Do you know why he didn't bring condemnation? He didn't need to. We need rescue because we're condemning ourselves. We hurt ourselves. Verse 26 and 27, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. The Greek word for crash is mega. A mega crash. But here's what's wild. One might assume that from a distance, these homes don't look much different in appearance. They might even look the same. They could appear the same until that storm comes. And when it comes, and it will, for some of us it has come already. The pandemic was a storm, was it not? And that was for all of us, the entire world. When the storm comes, and it will, it is revealing and telling not of how pretty your house is, not of how ornate it is, not of your decorations, not of your design, skills, and ability, but it's telling of your foundation. And listen, friends, no one walks up into your house and goes, I tell you what, man, that foundation that you have, where'd you get that? Beautiful. Are you kidding me? What? This is the greatest foundation I have ever seen in my entire life. No one does that. They're just like, oh, I love the new paint color on the wall. Beautiful. I love the artwork. Where'd you get it from? You know? Nice couch. Love it. But if we're not considering our foundation when the storm comes, that couch doesn't matter. That painting doesn't matter. That design doesn't matter. Listen, I love interior design. First one to admit it. But if you don't have a good foundation, it does not matter. So he isn't commanding. He isn't directing. If anything, Jesus is giving us commentary. Actually, he's giving us a warning. This is a warning passage. I think this should wake us up, man. Open our eyes. Or at least force us to probe with some questions about what grounds us, because the storm will come. Something will break in your life. Your job, a relationship, something physical with your body, something with a family member, something with a spouse, something with a friend, something in your mind. Something will happen. Now what? Hedonism, is that going to get you through? What if pleasure is not there? Money? What if you don't have the money? Education? What if that doesn't matter? What if that can't help you? What if your degree can't help you get through? Whatever foundation you have has to have an apologetic for suffering. It has to be able to get you through. Because it will come. And for some of us, it's beginning to come now. It's beginning to come. We have to be prepared for ourselves. We have to consider our foundation. Now, I mentioned earlier that I did grow up on the coast, about 30 minutes south of Topsail Island. Any of you guys go to Topsail Island in the summer? That's your beach of choice, yeah? Right? It's not Topsail, okay? It's Topsail. That's how they say it down south, okay? Topsail. Now, how many of you have been to North Topsail Beach before? North Topsail Beach, right? Not Surf City, North Topsail Beach, okay? North Topsail Beach is a mess. It's an eroding mess. Seriously. It's tragic. I actually have some pictures for you guys to see. Some of the homes, North Topsail Island. It is tragic, the amount of erosion that's happening at North Topsail Beach. They've called in like the Army Corps of Engineers, and I read some pieces online that were basically saying it's like putting money down the toilet. Like, this is happening. This home on the right, you can't actually see it, but it says danger, do not enter. Right? Water is coming underneath homes at high tide, or especially king tide or storm surges, condemning homes. But guess what? They're all beautiful. They are beautiful. And I bet they cost someone a lot of money at one point in time. But for a lot of us, I think we're more concerned with our life having a beach house than it possibly getting wiped away by the storm. Rather than having a strong, solid foundation on the mainland, we want a pretty home on the coast, but it's at risk of eroding away. Something everyone needs to know this morning. You can build your house on sand. These homes were. Your life can be as well. It is an option for all of us. And notice that he doesn't say why or the reason the person built their house on sand. I think we tend to just assume that the person was an obstinate rebel. No, it doesn't say that. Could it have been about speed? They wanted to build a house quick, fast. Could it have been about convenience? It's just easier. It's easier to build a house on sand. It's quicker, it's cheaper, it's faster. What's a marker of our time? Speed. Convenience. Unlimited choices. It doesn't say. It doesn't say why the person builds a house on sand. Various reasons why. But the question at the end of the day isn't so much the appearance or look of the house, but it's the home's foundation. Its groundedness, its firmness, its basis, which goes back to the root word of kingdom. I mentioned the word kingdom is connected to the word basilica, which is connected to the word basis or base, grounding, footing, for which we build off of. I love Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of this parable where he says, "These words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life." They're not additions, friends. These are not items of decor to put up in your house. Okay? These are not Hobby Lobby pieces of art that you hang up in your foyer or in your living room. Okay? They're not homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words, words to build a life on. Some of us, our discipleship to Jesus looks more like having a lot of Christian quotes on the wall, but we don't have the foundation of the King underneath our house. And that's what he's after. He says, if you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Jesus operates as teacher all throughout the gospel story, as we've seen. But what he is really doing is offering himself as the builder of our life's foundation. However, he reiterates here that we are builders as well. You and I are builders of our lives. We build the structure of our home. We cooperate with him. He will not, friends, build your house for you. He will not build the structure for you. He will not build your rule of life for you. He will not build your habits. He will not build your rhythms. That is for you to do. He is merely the foundation of it all. So the question is, how do we build our life on this foundation? How do we put his teachings to practice? I want to give you a quick model, 3 words to take with you. Uber practical. This is Adrian von Kamp's MRI model. So just remember, MRI is helpful when we consider how do we put his teachings into practice. The first is we have to have a motivation. This may require inspiration, but friends, listen, inspiration only has to do with a good idea. Motivation has to do with action. Right? You can be inspired by a TED Talk and not put anything into action. But motivation has to do specifically with action. Okay? Receiving inspiration of the Spirit, certainly, but there has to be a deep-seated motivation to move towards what God has for you and I. Without motivation, you will not change. And it can't just necessarily be internal. We have to have the community of God around us motivating us along the way. Keep walking. Keep running the race. Keep going. Keep it up. It's okay. We're here. We've got you. Remember, remember, remember. Every time we come to the table, it's a re-motivating factor. Remember. Keep going. Keep walking. There has to be a deep, sort of transcendent motivation within us. The second is there has to be reiteration, specifically of new habits and practices that we adopt. Scripture reading, prayer, generosity, compassion, you name all these different dispositions. We have to reiterate them in our life. Gathering together, serving the poor. These are done privately and communally, but they have to be reiterated and driven by that deep spiritual motivation. Not just repetition, because that's just functionalism. But we have to reiterate the habits based on the inner motivation. And motivation, ultimately, guys, comes from a cause and a story. We do a lot of what we do and believe a lot of what we believe based on the story in which we live in about reality. The third and final element is there has to be integration. So these habits and practices and dispositions, attitudes of the heart, have to be integrated into our whole life field, not just church programs, not just Sunday morning, not just house church, but in our work, in our families, in our life, in our private spaces, in the closet, so to speak, with our kids, with our friends, how we engage society around us. We have to pursue, at this point, a 3-dimensional life of formation. Von Kamm calls this participation, where these habits and dispositions integrate the entirety of our whole field of life. Some of us are disintegrated because we've reiterated habits and practices, but those dispositions and habits haven't infiltrated the whole of our formation field, the whole of our life. So there's fragmentation, disintegration. We feel dis-ease. Because for some of us, we're blocking those habits and dispositions from entering into, for a lot of us, our work, our family of origin, our relationships, our hobbies, our interests. So motivation, reiteration, and integration, MRI. We consider, how do we put these teachings to practice? So, as we begin this world-changing manifesto of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, I want you to ask 3 questions today, going into this week. Maybe in house church, you discuss it. Maybe in your confession band, you discuss it. The first question is, what is my life built on now? What is my foundation now? What's my reason for living now? What story am I living in? Is it grounded? Does it have an apologetic for suffering? Is it stable? And then ask the second question, how close is it to this, the Sermon on the Mount? As we walk through, how close is my foundation to what I'm reading here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7? And the third question, I've already kind of hinted at it. Can my foundation sustain a storm? Can it sustain a storm? Because that, friends, is how you have to test its validity. It's the only way you can test the validity of your foundation is, can it get you through a storm? Are you wise or foolish today? On what kind of foundation is your home built? And it might be pretty. It might be ornate. It might be well-designed. And some of us might not have well-designed homes. They might not be pretty, but it might have a strong foundation. And what we have to ask today is, what's the foundation of my life? As we consider the greatest moral document and moral teaching in the history of humankind. So as we come to the table this morning, let us pray. This is our response that we provide every single week, to come to Eucharist, a place of thanksgiving. Because for some of us to get any kind of inspiration or motivation, it actually begins with gratitude. It begins by speaking out loud what it is that God has already done in our life to reveal how strong He is for us. How He is a mighty fortress, how we are to cling to Him, how He rescues us and has rescued before. So I pray that as we come to the table, it actually motivates us even more. That His broken body motivates us. That His poured out blood motivates us this morning.